I will turn it over to David Ackerley, who is going to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks everyone for coming. I love the reliability of the full room at MVC. Awesome. And first, why your local plant ecologist is introducing a visiting ornithologist. Here on campus, some people know I run a NSF, it's called NSF Research Traineeships. It was the successor to IGERTS. And I met Jeff because he runs a similar program, or parallel program at University of Oklahoma, and I went out to visit him last year, which was wonderful. So really pleased to have him come visit. He's been visiting with some of our students in our program, and then also glad to have him here at the MVZ. Jeff started at University of Maine as an undergrad, graduate degrees at Colorado State and Oklahoma State University before landed at University of Oklahoma. Actually, 2012 as professor. Did you start? Is that when you started?
No, 2002.
2002. Sorry, 2002. Okay, I should go. Yeah, that would be much better as a professor at University of Oklahoma. Also, he is now director of the Oklahoma Biological Survey, and most recently became the founding chair of a new Plains Institute at the University of Oklahoma, which he may want to say more about. So his graduate traineeship program that he runs, and also a lot of his research, is around this field of agroecology. I may not be the only one. When I first picked up like a list from NSF and thought, oh, there's an agroecology program, and it's like, well, that's not a G. Agroecology. I didn't know what it was, and now I do. Having spent some time with Jeff, which is great. I'm really pleased to have him here to share his research.
Thanks, David. Thank you all. Had a great visit so far. It's nice to get to talk to many of you, and look forward to talking to others in the next day or so. I appreciate the invitation. This is our traineeship program, and we do have some innovative ideas around graduate student training, interdisciplinary graduate student training, and this idea of thinking about the lower atmosphere as a habitat and environment in which humans are building infrastructure, which is having impacts on the ecology of that system, and thinking about that from a biological sciences perspective, but also social sciences. So if that's something that's interesting to you, I'd be happy to talk to you about it more. What I'm going to talk about today is research that we've been doing, primarily using weather radars to understand migration phenology, and I'll give you a couple of examples of projects that we're working on, and sort of where that's leading us and how we're thinking more about sort of large-scale migration systems. So here's an outline for the talk. So I'll talk a little bit in introduction about migration phenology from sort of songbird perspective to a systems perspective, and then I'll talk a little bit about nocturnal songbird migration, and then a sort of species-specific example of purple martins and migration phenology of purple martins. The motivation behind our work is sort of this long standing and really good biological examples. This is a paper by Terry Root published in 2003 showing a whole bunch of phenological time series suggesting that climate change is altering the phenologies of wide numbers of taxa, right? And so from a migration perspective, this is one of the things that we're very interested in trying to quantify these effects both spatially and temporally. And so one of the issues that we have is that our time series come from particular places, often idiosyncratically located, just because those have long series of data collection. And it's very difficult to make spatial and temporal inferences from those data sets to places that don't have those long time series records. So is there some way we can overcome this sort of spatial and temporal problem? This is a paper by Melissa Bolin and a number of colleagues, 2010, talking about grand challenges in migration biology, and this is sort of a seminal paper in terms of outlaying the, what should be the future questions. And what I wanted to emphasize here, and these emphases are mine, is that many of these are sort of at the organismal scale, right? So there's one here, and this is the one that I'm probably primarily going to be looking at and interested in, is integrating living and physical systems, and I think this is one that largely, as ornithologists, we haven't focused on very much, right? So we've been much more interested in the sort of organismal perspective on migration phenology. A lot of that perspective comes from technology, right? So as tracking devices get smaller, the ability to answer questions that we've had for a long time becomes more and more possible, right? And so this is just a chart of the body sizes of migratory birds, and what we see is that as these tracking devices, innovations in tracking devices get smaller, it becomes much more possible to study average birds rather than just large birds, and that lets us maybe broaden our inference about what's going on in migration. And then we learn that a whole bunch of the things that we thought were happening in terms of optimal migration really are not the way things are happening. So that's been very revealing. This is sort of my history of tracking migration, right? So as a student, I began with bird banding and putting lots and lots of bands on lots and lots of birds that I never saw again. And I'm spending a lot of time in the field thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. Then I got big into stable isotopes in the 90s, using hydrogen isotope ratios, and I still do this work. Still a very useful tool, and still trying to push the boundaries on what's possible with stable isotope ratios. Around 2009, 2010, as it became possible to build these geolocators, I started placing geolocators and geologgers on birds to try to get individual migration tracks. Right, so I've sort of followed this progression of increasing the ability to track individuals through space and time. And so this is a paper from us and our colleagues using these geologgers to track painted buntings from their breeding grounds in Oklahoma down into the wintering grounds in Mexico, and then sort of comparing that, and so this is where my interest in phenological tracking comes in, compared with random tracks that are just built to sort of optimize exposure to a vegetation index. In this case, Enhanced Vegetation Index, EVI, right, which is remotely sensed MODIS product, right? And so we saw high correspondence between what the individual birds were doing and what you would see based on this randomization procedure if you were trying to optimize your exposure to green vegetation. And so this is sort of where this promising idea comes from that perhaps migratory birds are tracking this vegetation green up, and that this is a driver for migration timing and the phenology of migration. This idea that we want to track all of these birds is not new, right? So here's a bioscience paper from 1963, right, where Dwayne Warner says, you know, the advances in microelectronics is going to make it possible to track everything. And I think what I start to realize as I see all of these tracking studies of all of these species is that it's going to be very difficult to add those things up to understand large-scale migration systems. Right? Are we ever going to be able to track all of these species in the same time across all of these places? What's that going to cost? What's the infrastructure behind that need to look like? Right, so if you are interested in the migration systems and how the migration systems are changing with respect to, let's say, climate change or land use change, can you do enough individual species, can you track enough individuals to quantify those effects? And then how do you get the historical data, and how do you cover the space and time that you need to? So this is what started driving us to think about what would a sort of system approach to migration look like, right? What if it was less about the individual tracks and more about the density and distribution and timing of migrants, right, as a sort of group of consumers rather than sort of individuals of species, right? And we can think about all of these important processes as migrants move from wintering grounds to breeding grounds, where we would expect to add biomass of consumers on the breeding ground, and then as they move through the aerosphere here in spring and fall, and go to wintering grounds where you would expect to lose biomass of consumers. And so if we start thinking about that from a sort of system perspective, what do we think that migration phenology would look like, right? So this is sort of a conceptual idea of phenology where if we have some vegetation index and we can conceptualize primary productivity as a wave in the temperate spring, you might expect migration phenology to look something like this at the beginning of that green wave, and then migrants leaving at the end, and then you could hypothesize different environmental effects, right? So if spring advances, maybe migration becomes more protracted, right? So you would expect a curve that goes from like this narrow curve out to a broader curve, right? If increase in primary productivity is good for migrants, you might expect increased magnitude of fall migrants, right? Because you're producing more fall migrants, and so there's more birds alive as they migrate in the fall, and so you would detect more migrants as a sort of mass flow idea. And so we'll use these curves as a way to think about what we expect out of a migration system. Okay, so if we think about migrants, right, you might have some curve that describes spring migration, and then a standard methodology for these phenology curves is to identify this date, start of season, right? And you can do this for vegetation indices, and you can do it for migrants as well. The method that I'm going to use is this midpoint method, which is used commonly in vegetation phenology. And essentially, it says the start of season is essentially half the magnitude of the season. So that, unless I say otherwise, that's the method that I use. There's a bunch of different methods you can use, which is one thing I learned a lot about, more than I wanted to. So this is, let's say this is your local domain. This is Berkeley, right? Migrants come through, and you have some peak flow of migration, and this would be a description of the local migration event, so in one place. If you went and measured migration in multiple places, you would get multiple curves, and you might identify multiple start of season events that vary for any number of reasons for a particular place. If those places were aligned on a gradient, right, of productivity or timing, then those start of season events, let's say against latitude, should be arrayed in some sort of progression, right? Here I've drawn it as a linear progression, right? But this would be a common expectation, that start of spring would be later further north than it is further south. Simple. This has been called the green wave when it refers to plants. And it's an interesting concept. If you track it down in the literature, it actually goes back to Andre Drent used it in 1978 in a book chapter. Just shows up, and then it's randomly cited, and variously shows up in the literature, but there is no sort of quantitative background to it. It's all sort of a narrative description. And so you'll see a lot of tests of the green wave hypothesis. It's never sort of, in the literature that I can find, ever sort of formally been laid out as a hypothesis or what it actually is. But for our purposes, I'm treating it like this. The literature on migratory birds is varied with respect to these patterns, right? So some studies, so here's a study by Emily Cohen and co-authors, and they found for Gulf migrants it was unrelated to environmental conditions, and this included an analysis of vegetation indices, right? So there was no sort of tracking of migrants that they could detect using a number of different indices. Here's a fall study by Rosalind Renfro looking at bobolinks, and they did find a tracking of vegetation. So the birds' migration seemed to be tied to where there was particularly high new growth in vegetation. And I will say, well, maybe I'll say this later. Yes, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole yet. Okay, so let's talk about nocturnal songbird migration. And this is where I'm going to talk about our use of radar data. So you probably are aware that we have a network of radar data. One of the things that's unusual about the US is that because we span the continent, which is not true for most countries, and because we have one implementation of technology, and the data are open, publicly available, it makes us very unusual in the world in terms of being able to access the data. And it's archived, right, back to the mid-1990s. So this is a big sensor network. The way this works, in the simplest terms, is you send out a radio pulse, it bounces off moisture in the atmosphere, and is received, and that we refer to as reflectivity. And so most of what I'm going to talk about in terms of radar products is reflectivity. There are other products that are useful for other things, and I'll mention those. But these are the data that we'll be looking at. So here is a national map from September 29th, 2011. And so this is weather, right? So this is the weather across the United States as based on the NEXRAD weather system. And what the government is hiding from you is that this is the data. Those are the birds, right? And potentially some bats down here, right? Particularly down here. I mean, bats potentially everywhere, but really down here, free-tailed bats. And so a lot of this data is filtered out when you see your weather forecast, right? But it is available. And one of the things that's been a big improvement for us is that recently those data were moved so that they're available through Amazon Web Services, right? Which makes our lives a lot easier in terms of accessing and processing the data. Because even though it was available always through the National Climate Data Center, moving those files back and forth was just very time-consuming. So this has been a big improvement. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about weather data products. So this is the one we'll mostly use, and so this is reflectivity, and so you see green colors, typically more intense, higher reflectivity, blues and then grays. Radial velocity we've always had, right? And so this means that essentially whatever is detected in the atmosphere is flowing this way relative to the radar, and so the radar would be located in the middle here. This is a relatively new product, this correlation coefficient, and it only became available about 2013. And when the national radar system was upgraded to dual polarimetry, right? So when you got dual polarimetry, that is waves in both the horizontal and vertical plane, you got some new data products, and those have been important to us, and I can talk more about that if you're interested. So this gives us essentially, if we can be sure that it's biological scatterers in the atmosphere, this tells us how much is there. The correlation coefficient can tell us something about the heading of the bird, and so what's been so important here is that this is now behavioral. So now we can tell something about the behavior of the birds in the air. So we know this bird is heading this way, and yet we know that the drift of the birds is this way, right? So it gives us an index of compensation by the birds in the air, right? And so we have different wind conditions, we have different types of birds in the air, and now we can tell not only how much is up there, in what way is it moving, but behaviorally, how are the birds adjusting for the wind, or are they adjusting for the wind? I'm not going to talk a lot about that. A recent PhD grad of mine, he's now at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, has a couple of nice papers out about that drift and how birds are selecting locations, both elevationally and spatially, with respect to compensation for wind. And so that's been really an important breakthrough. Okay, so we're going to use the radar data. The other thing that we're going to use is eBird data, right? So we have the mass of the birds in the air from the radar, but we don't really know anything about what they are, right? And so what we like to do is use the eBird data from the ground to give us a sense of what is in the air, right? And so the question is, do they tell us the same sorts of things? So the first study that I want to tell you about is we took the radar data from the entire East Coast, and so these are the radar locations. And we took both that reflectivity measure from the radar data, but we also took the eBird data from these same domains, right? And what we want to know is, can we reproduce sensible phenologies? That is, do we see a signal of bird migration in the radar and in the eBird data? And if we do they make sense biologically? And so conceptually, what we'd like to do is go beyond this and start to look at sort of the environmental piece related to these phenologies. But at this point, we really are still validating the fact that we can produce these phenologies, right? These phenological curves from these new sensors. But ultimately, our goal is to try to correlate those with the environmental factors that are influencing those phenologies. Okay, so do radar and eBird provide quantitative measures of phenology? Is there evidence of consistent or conflicting phenological patterns? Right? And then last, we want to talk about these environmental factors. So I'm going to just jump right to the results. So here's our data. And so for these data, what we've done is we've grouped the radars, red as north, green as central, and blue as south. And these are essentially the phenology curves we produce. And what you should see is that each of these has a peak date, which is good because that's the way we think phenology of migration works. So in this column here, we have the radar data, so reflectivity, and here we have the eBird data, and so we're just looking at this as species richness, right? And so we see a close match in terms of the dates of peak between the radar data and the eBird data, and also as we go further north, the peaks get later in the year, right? So this gives us some confidence that we are measuring phenology, and that the two data sets, even though they're unrelated, are providing similar sorts of evidence about when migration is occurring. Okay. And we can dive in a little deeper here, and I'll just show you this. So this is data from each of the radars for each of the nights, and we've coded these by month. And so what you see is what we would expect, essentially in winter, right? We don't see any correlation between richness and reflectivity in the air, and that's good. And as we get later in the spring, we see a higher correlation. We see both more reflectivity, that is more migration, right, and a higher correlation between the species richness of the migrants, right? And so again, the correlation between the two data sets increases at the times we expect migration to be most intense. Relative to other measures of phenology, so we took temperature data as a potential environmental cue for migration, and so what we used was the last night that the air temperature reached 5 degrees C, right? So, but we've done this for other temperatures, so I'm going to show you that one temperature threshold. You could obviously use 0 or 10 degrees, well, you might not be able to use 10. The other data that I'm going to show you are the vegetation indices, right? I'm not going to talk about land cover today, but I'm going to show you the vegetation index data for each of the radar domains. Let me just walk you through this figure. So here we have date, right? So this is essentially our green wave hypothesis, right? So date on this axis, latitude on this axis, we expect positive slopes as spring advances. And so what we see is here is the eBird data, right? So we see this progression of spring migration across the latitudes. Here is the radar data, right? So we see similar, although flatter slope. Temperature data is sort of right in there, and that's why I picked that temperature threshold, is because it's close to those other two curves. And then we looked at a couple of other spring index data. This is a modeled data set that uses temperature data to predict leaf out of a couple of species of lilacs. And it has a much steeper curve. The interesting one to me is this is start of spring dates from NDVI data, remotely sensed vegetation phenology. That was unexpected, right? And I honestly spent probably months trying to figure out what I did with this, and I'll talk more about that later. This is a lesson in interdisciplinarity, my own personal lesson in interdisciplinarity. So what this made us think, so this was the first time we've done this, is can we do more of this, right? So do you always get these curves, or is this just some happenstance? Is this sort of a one-off? And so I want to just show you a quick example from another study that we're just finishing up. It's actually in review. So we did the same sort of things from the central flyway, essentially, radars from the Gulf Coast up through Minnesota. There's a couple of things. This is some of the behavioral data that I'm not really going to talk about, but it is interesting. So these migrants come across the Gulf, and they really look like they're heading preferentially heading this way until you get up to about here, and then they're sort of preferentially heading through the ceiling. And if you're interested in that, let me know. We can talk more about it. But for those same radars, and this is 3 years of data, these are the phenology curves, right? And so what we see is, with bluer colors in the south, you see the peaks earlier, with northern peaks later on. So again, reproducing that same pattern that we expect phenologically. And what's more interesting about this is that we also can then, based on the eBird data, link this back to traits of the birds, right? So as we get later, you see declining airspeeds, right? And this is primarily because we're getting waterfowl and waterbirds early, we're getting songbirds late, right? So you get this pattern between the airspeed of the birds as they go by the radar and the body mass of the birds that we know are on the ground based on the eBird data, right? So again, these two data sets seem to be telling us both at a large scale how migration is operating, and so for some really big sort of life history traits like body mass, we can start to look at how birds are compensating for environmental characteristics. Okay, so I'm going to jump now from songbird migration into purple martins. Okay, so purple martins is a species that we've worked with for a long time. They're a really interesting, almost unique, I would say, bird in that in the east, almost all of these birds, I will say all of these birds, are raised in houses provided by people. So in people's backyards. Which is interesting and in some ways complicated. The other thing about them is, like many aerial insectivores, they are declining, particularly across the northern tier. Right? So there's something common to aerial insectivores, and this crosses the swallows, the swifts, bats as well, across the northern tier. And it's not entirely clear why there's a decline. Right? So there's this narrative among purple martin landlords, so they identify themselves as landlords, the people who raise purple martin, that many of the landlords in this area are essentially retiring and moving to Florida. Right? That's the reason for the decline, is that there's a decrease in housing. And it may in part be the answer, but it doesn't explain why the pattern is similar to other swallows and swifts. So if you've never been to a purple martin roost, so after martins breed, they go to these communal roosts. And so these martins actually spend most of the year in these roosts, either in the US or Mexico, down into South America. They're amazing. Tens of thousands of birds come into these roosts. And so this is in Texas, near Dallas. And every night these birds come in, and people are in these parking lots, and you hear amazing interpretations of what's going on in this place. So if you get a chance to go to one of these things, I would. It's a fun experience. Okay, so for purple martins, we want to essentially ask the same sorts of questions that we just asked for nocturnal migration, right? We're going to use a radar proxy, we're going to use an eBird proxy, we're going to look at the phenological patterns, and then we're going to compare them to the temperature and vegetation phenology data. Okay, so indirect observations are radar. So what happens at these roosts is these birds all come in at night, right? And sometimes they're detectable in the radar as they come in. But in the morning, right before sunrise, they all leave the roost in a short period of time. And as they leave the roost, they go in all directions, and they form these really characteristic rings that you can see in the radar. And so if you look in the radar, in the raw radar data, between June and August in the east, you'll see these rings all over the place. And just to sort of give you a sense, this is just an animation of one morning, and that's a roost right there. And so these are the kinds of things that we're looking for. And so for 9 years, so this is an old map, for 9 years we've been mapping all of the roost locations in the eastern US. So 2017 is our 9th year, and we're most of the way done with it. And so we have locations. We know we can get these locations within about 3 kilometers of the roost on the ground based on some trial data. So we know for each of those 9 years how many years these have been active, the start dates, the end dates, and those sorts of things. And so we wanted to use that phenology that we can get from those data, and we want to compare these to some eBird data. And so let me tell you how we used eBird data. So this won't be roost. This is going to be a start of migration index. Right, so these are eBird observations of purple martins. There's a lot of them. And so this is just going to show you sort of the accumulation from 2009 through present of martin observations, right? So that's 80,000. What we did was we divided these up into latitudinal bins. And we looked at occurrence of martins. And we're going to use the occurrence of martins on eBird checklist to give us a start of migration date. And so this is kind of what we did. So martins aren't occurring on checklists through the winter, right? So very low occurrence, and then at some point they start to occur on checklists. And so when this sort of crosses the upper confidence interval, we say, okay, that's start of migration. And so we use this as a start of migration index for martins. And what's amazing to me is that based on these eBird checklists from 2010 through 2016, we get really narrow, really tight start of migration dates for martins, right? They're all sort of within a 1-week period. So they're really consistent coming in, particularly in the south. There's some other stuff going on up here. If you look closely, you might see like, 2010 was pretty late, right? So you see a lot of dark purple dots above the line. And there's some other patterns there. And these are the radar data, right? So this is start of roosting. It's still a good relationship, not quite as tight as we saw with the start of season. So we have a start of migration, and then in between, after the start of migration, we have all of the nesting, and then we have start of roosting. So we have these sort of 2 phenological markers that we can look at, and we actually have others, right? And so the question is, again, do these environmental factors influence the timing of these phenological events? Here we're going to, again, look at sort of vegetation index data. So this should look similar, right? So we have, here's the start of the roosting days, right? Here's the start, the first of season, right? So start of migration. So start of migration, start of roosting. Here's the temperature threshold in between, right? So all looking like the spring patterns that we expect. And here's the vegetation index again. Right? And so this is a completely different data set, different years. Similar pattern in that it doesn't show a spring pattern. Right? And so if I think about my nocturnal migrants, with this pattern and the start of spring dates for the vegetation index, here's my purple martins, right? This stuff isn't sort of matching my expectation. And I guess the lesson that I learned from this, aside from figuring out that these data sets will provide you with good ways to measure phenology of bird migration, is that you should probably pay attention to the people who are working seriously on the vegetation indices. This is a 2009 paper. And I have a hard time reading this figure, but so here's latitude on this axis, right? And here's start of season, and the pattern goes the wrong way. It doesn't go the way we hypothesized that it goes in the middle latitudes. And so this was known, right? So I flipped that figure on its side now, right? So here's the mid-latitudes that we're looking at for the US, right? And here's the start of season date, right? We're actually going the wrong direction. And you only really get a strong pattern, the pattern in the direction we expected, as you get above, let's say, 50 degrees latitude in the far north, right? So there's a whole bunch of migration literature out there on birds that's trying to test this correspondence between migration timing and green up of vegetation with the start of spring indices, when the underlying pattern in the vegetation data don't support just the basic premise that Star of Spring has a latitudinal pattern in the mid-latitudes. And this is why there's conflict in the literature, because a lot of the studies that find the pattern are done further north. Right? They're done in the boreal, or they're done in the Arctic, and they find strong patterns there where the vegetation pattern is much cleaner. And the only reason I figured this out is Kirsten De Beers is at the University of Oklahoma, and after banging my head against the wall about all the ways I was calculating Start of Spring the wrong way, I went over and talked to her. And she said, here, you should read this. Maybe I could be more efficient about that. So I'm really excited because I do think the prospect for using both the radar data and the eBird data for measuring long-term migration phenologies across space and time is powerful for understanding how climate and land use change are affecting migration at a system level. It looks like temperature is a strong candidate for a good migration timing indicator. And so then the question would be, how does that work? And then the vegetation indices are problematic for migration studies. I'd be happy to answer questions. One thing I'd like to say is we are operating a radar aeroecology training school, so if you're interested in using radar data in your research, and I can show you examples from bats and insects that also contain similar sorts of information. And if you want to learn how to do it yourself, come out to OU this summer and we'll show you how. Thanks.
All right, we've got time for questions. If somebody could hit the lights on the back there.
Yeah.
The Pied Flycatcher in Europe is declining because of mismatch in the phenology of the
Right.
peak abundance insects. So you had mentioned you had no idea why the species in North America were declining in the insectivores, and I'm wondering if you had considered the Pied Flycatcher situation.
The Pied Flycatcher is an interesting example in that it seems like that story evolves every few years, right? So it originally was presented as a simple mismatch. The birds couldn't keep up with the pace of change in leaf out and then the caterpillar abundance. But now it looks like generationally the birds do arrive earlier, but their arrival time gets fixed within their lifetime. And so then the individuals don't advance, but it's possible that their offspring do. And so it's complicated to try to, at least for me, to try to use that explanation to think about how sort of marten phenology might be mismatched with let's say, resources in the northern latitudes, or sort of, let's say, aerial insectivores in general, right? Other people have argued that it is the concentration of neonicotinoids, pesticides in those regions that have, because most of these most of the species are heavily reliant on aquatic emergent insects, and there's some evidence that those neonicotinoid pesticides are concentrating in those water bodies. Although I haven't seen a study that shows that definitively, right? So I think, and then there's the complicating factor that for bats, white nose syndrome has certainly decreased those populations separate and apart from the other patterns that we see. So I do think it's complicated when you get down to the sort of species by species pattern. Yeah, John.
So they're not riding the green wave, but could they be riding a sort of weather pattern wave that is common in the spring, so that, because I mean, just as anecdotally, when big storms hit locally, I seem to see robins in the spring. You know,
Right.
Seems like a pretty low-tech observation.
So there definitely is, there's a low-level jet, right? So if you follow the jet stream, sort of dips down into Texas, and then it comes up out of the Gulf, And it definitely is a major driver for the timing of, the episodic timing of migration in the spring, right? And it's a very profitable time to migrate, right? And you'll see these frontal events come through, and it's pretty, if you know when they're coming, it is pretty predictable, sort of the days on which migration will occur. And one of the problems we have is, even with a long data set, if we look over the Gulf of Mexico, most of the migrants might come over the Gulf on 5 days in the spring, right? There's migration on most nights, but if you look at the absolute magnitude, there might be 5 days. And so if that changes from 5 to 4, is that significant? Or if even with a long continuous data record, there's just these huge migration nights, and it's very difficult to tell whether those nights have changed on a sort of like, comparison basis. Yeah.
I had a question sort of about conservation and the martins. So you were talking about the nest boxes, the possibility of those disappearing and causing some of them to disappear, but
Right.
what about the roosting spots? Have you seen roosting spots disappear through your studies?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So there will be like these purple martin conservation festivals, right? And there will be a whole event around it. And people love them and will come down. In other places, people hate them.
So
Hate them, right? So in Dallas, those were Bartlett pear trees in the parking lot between a bowling alley and a super Walmart, right? And
How long are those
most
gonna
of
be
the people down there were trying to figure out how to get rid of them, right? And so people will cut down those trees. So there was a terrible incident in Oklahoma City where the birds started congregating at the National Bombing Memorial. And the federal government actually was spraying them with fire hoses out of the trees. And I didn't know where to begin with trying to educate around what are you doing? So I do think, and it's really, I think from a social science perspective, it's really interesting because all of these birds are raised by people who love them. And then they aggregate in places, particularly in urban areas where people hate them. I mean, so to me, that's just a really interesting question about why is there such a strong difference of opinion about those birds. But it ranges the full gamut. And some of these sites, particularly in urban areas, are very stable. Right, the birds will come back. Highlands Mall in Austin, Texas. The birds are there every year, right? And crowds come out to see them every year. In other places, particularly in the Midwest, maybe in cornfields or things like that, they're one-year roosts, and birds never seem to come back to that same place. And so there's just a really interesting sort of transiency or permanency.
I feel like I must have misunderstood something when you were saying there's no green wave in the mid-latitudes. I mean, it sort of defies common sense. Doesn't spring come earlier to, say, Georgia than upstate New York, and don't the trees leaf out later as you go further north?
Right, so, and I think the difference is between knowing that and coming up with an index that reflects that. Right, so the indexes in the vegetation index that are commonly used to reflect that pattern don't. And so it might be that the birds are surfing a green wave, but it's not measured that way. It's not the way that we have commonly remotely sensed that pattern, right? And so all of the literature around start of spring would suggest that pattern isn't a simple latitudinal gradient.
But for example, the date when trees leaf out doesn't follow latitude pretty clearly?
I would suggest that it probably does. I would be shocked if it didn't. It
Yeah.
doesn't show up in this data set in that way.
But just to jump in, that graph started at 25 degrees, which is the subtropics. So you have a lot of evergreens. There's no spring in the tropics. So I think this looks like a temperate to tropical transition in terms of, which is separate from the NDVI technicalities. But
Right.
actually, on reflection, I mean, at first it's a surprise, but I think it's beyond the temperate zone.
Well, but a lot of that was 30 to 50, which is
Right.
in
No, but
North
that's where it
America.
came in. It was the 25 to
Well, let's go back.
up to 30. It was up to about 40 when it kicked in.
Which way do you want to look at it?
Yeah. But it starts, but
Well, the next figure that you
Yeah.
flipped
Yeah.
over.
You like it better that way?
Yeah, much better.
I agree.
I have a hard time
It's
reading.
25, see, it's 20, yeah.
It's 25 to 40, so it's coming out of the subtropics up into temperate where it reverses, which is.
So, I mean,
Right, so this is like
Evergreen.
30, you know, this is 30 to 40,
Yeah.
mid-40s here.
And that's why it flips
It's
up
going the wrong
higher,
way.
higher latitude.
I
Right,
mean,
so
45 is right across Michigan, right?
Yeah, so this is like, you know, this is north of here.
Yeah.
Right, you know, and so,
I mean, so that encompasses Georgia to upstate New York, and,
Yeah.
and common sense, I mean, I lived in upstate New York, and
right,
it was,
it's not spring yet.
no, that's right.
Right, and so so much of literature about start of spring is tied to these indices that, you know, I think that is in part why, I would have to go back a ways. But that other spring index that I calculated, this one here, I think in part that's the motivation to do this, is that these data are not reflecting the pattern. So this is around sort of lilac leaf out, right? It's using a temperature model for lilac leaf out. And I think the motivation for creating these newer indices is that these data don't seem to reflect the pattern that common sense would suggest is occurring in the spring. Right? And so whether this is the model to use or whether this is actually something that migrant birds are queuing to, I think is a better question.
Or is there, as you tried to do in B, is there an index of start of season that, rather than the midpoint of those curves, that is better to use? But they, you know, looking at those kinds of phenological timing for bird nesting, you know, sometimes you see them go up and then hesitate
Right.
for a while, then you get another jump, and it's very complicated. And here you're mixing, you got all kinds of species, some of which are starting early, some of which later. Even the white-thumb woods, the same species, there's so much individual variation among the trees in the timing of when individuals, the same species are starting to emerge. So in a way, the green up might just be a hard thing to get a good measure for. Is
Right, and I can say that
initialization.
we did look at a lot of different ways to calculate this index, and the ones that we could calculate because the curves would support them, they all showed the same pattern.
Okay.
Right, and then there were some where the curves would fail because we didn't either have the data or other problems.
Yeah, isn't there a data set for when plants are blooming? Is that what I'm talking about?
Right, so
Yeah.
there are a number of data sets that are citizen science based.
Yeah.
Like cherry trees and.
Yeah, whatever.
Right.
Well,
National
the lilacs, the biggest one is the lilac.
The lilac data set.
That is the biggest data set.
Okay.
Yeah. And so there are other data sets that you can use. The issue you get into is the spatial coverage again.
Yeah.
Right? Is the great part about the remotely sensed data is they span the US. Whereas the other data, it's hard to get spatial coverage.
Okay.
Thank
So-
you.
Well, thanks. Just before we wrap up, Jeff has a couple openings in his schedule, I think at 2:30 and at 3:30 this afternoon. So if there's anyone who'd like to meet individually or if students want to pair up. And then I think I'll be going out and probably a couple people from our training program who are mostly are not here, but at probably around 6, going out for drinks or light dinner or anything. So if anyone wants to come along later in the evening, just shoot me an email. I'll let you know where you want. So,
Great.
thanks very much, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.